Well, good morning, and I know more people will be coming in. I feel like the front row is a little empty right now. Good to be here, and just maybe an administrative note here. In the elevator today, this morning coming down, General Twitty promoted Megan Torrey to the rank of general officer. So there was this, give her a hand. Yeah, you may not have known that was possible to do, but we did it. And so General Megan, good to be back here today. Great topic, and according to General Twitty, the best panel ever today. So in a world of geopolitical shifts, nation-state threats, and technological disruptions, the role of defense organizations remains central to maintaining global peace and stability. It's no longer just about physical might, but about who can best harness the power of emerging technologies for strategic advantage. Think social media, and some of the things that General Twitty said in his opening remarks about disruptive technologies. These technologies are not just mere add-ons. They can provide strategic advantage, reshaping battlefield realities, and redefining concepts of warfare. Nowhere is that reality more apparent than our most complex missions, such as those that support nuclear defense and deterrence. This dramatic shift compels defense organizations to be at the forefront of technological innovation, not only to maintain the balance of power, but to navigate and establish rules in this era of digital conflict and cooperation. However, when I think about innovation, I always think about the human element that is the tip of the spear. I visited Eastern Europe several times this past year, talking to our employees at General Dynamics, as well as our military members who are operating and securing systems that are critical to our global security. It brings home the differentiating role of technology playing in multiple theaters. It reminds us that we can never lose sight of the mission and the warfighter when we think about innovation. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce today's distinguished panel. First up, Lieutenant General Laura Potter. She became the Army's 47th Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence, G2, in September 2020. She is the Senior Advisor to the Secretary of the Army and the Chief of Staff of the Army for all things intelligence, counterintelligence, security, as well as being responsible for training, equipping, and policy oversight of an Army intelligence and security enterprise. Our second panelist is Lieutenant General Steve Shepro, U.S. Air Force retired. He is currently the Vice President of Integrated Customer Solutions for Pratt & Whitney's Military Engines Division. Prior to joining private industry, General Shepro was the 21st Deputy Chairman of the NATO Military Committee. Next, Lieutenant General Stephen Twitty, U.S. Army retired. He is the founder of Twitty & Associates, a consulting and advisory firm, and specializes in strategic operational planning. You may have seen him several times on TV. General Twitty retired from the U.S. Army with over 36 years of his distinguished military service as an infantry officer, including the Deputy Commander of the U.S. European Command. And the three individuals that I just mentioned served together in 2018 to 2020 in Eastern Europe. And so it's interesting that we've been able to bring them together here today for this conversation. In addition, our final panelist is Major General Michael Henry St. Louis. He is an infantry officer with the 22nd Regiment, currently serving as the defense attaché for the United States at the Canadian Embassy. And last and not least, our moderator, Arthur House. Mr. House is an adjunct professor at the University of Connecticut and former cybersecurity policy advisor to Connecticut's Secretary of the State. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you, General. Well, we've got an outstanding panel, a very major question, and not nearly enough time to get full value of everything, so let's get into it as fast as we can. I just want to say what we're going to do, and then we'll get into the substance quickly. First of all, panelists, when you're asked to come here today, you usually have some advanced thoughts of the subject, and so you're each going to get 2 minutes to give your opening thoughts before we get into shared conversations. Then we've got some topics which we'll discuss. I invite you to, when somebody's finished, don't wait for me to call on you. If you see a following point, go ahead and jump right into the conversation. Then audience. A lot of people here with questions. I've been asked ahead of time, am I going to get a chance to ask a question? The answer is yes. So we want you to do that. Then, at the end, I want the panelists each to give about 1 minute each. Thoughts, reflections, what happened in the panel that you want to add a word to before we all conclude. All right? Let's just start. Go ahead. By the way, General Twitty today, you see him on television, he turned down a semi-command from MSNBC to come on television today because he had a better offer, he told them, which is to come to the Global Security Forum. All right. Let's start with you, General. Go ahead.
Okay. So good to see you all again. I got a couple of quick points for you that I really think is worth talking about here today. And that's number one, why Ukraine matters. But more importantly, when you look at the environment today, you're starting to see from the time this war started up until now, a pretty cohesive NATO led by a very capable Secretary General in Stoltenberg and U.S. leadership at the forefront of that. As we move forward, we got a couple of things that has the potential to change the environment. Number one, U.S. elections. And you're starting to see Poland, which probably, in the big scheme of things, they were probably the staunchest allies of the Ukraine, start to turn, and they're starting to wane. And so we're starting to see some fraying here in this coalition, this alliance. One of the reasons why we're also starting to see some fraying in the alliance is because we put expectations against the Ukrainians that are perhaps unrealistic. So I'm an infantry officer, spent 40 years in the infantry doing business. I fully understand what it means to attack through a minefield and conduct a counteroffensive. And we put this unrealistic timeline on the Ukrainians to have it done before winter here. It is not going to happen. And so the Ukrainians are making incremental but slow progress. And I guarantee you the progress, although it is tactical progress, if they keep at it, it will turn into strategic gains to where we cut the land bridge between Russia and Crimea. But we have to give them time. We got to give them time, we got to give them space, and we have to give them support. And I'll hold right there. I hope you guys come back and ask me questions about the time, the space, and support piece, particularly about the equipment piece that I think that they need. So I'll stop there.
Audience, remember to ask him that question. General Potter, you see some eyes here and close up, fixed especially on you, the West Point cadets who may actually have a few questions of their own. And we will not allow the question of how can I rise to the power that you have. Now, earlier, we were saying, boy, it's great to have the head of intelligence of the Army here, and your response was, no, it's great to have some retired generals because they can speak their mind freely. We encourage you to speak your mind freely. Please take it away, General.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the World Affairs Council and the Global Security Forum for the invitation, and it is certainly great to be back with co-panelists, all of whom I have served with before. I also do want to acknowledge the young men and women, both the cadets and young to me, the field grade officers in the room, because if you think about the 7 perils that General Twitty opened today's conference with, they are all interconnected. And the dynamic that any one of those perils contributes to the destabilization anywhere across the globe, it's just the most complicated security environment I have witnessed in my 34 years of doing intelligence. I don't pretend to have the market on expertise on Russia, but I do have some experience. My first experience was as a student during the Cold War, and yes, that makes me old for you people in the front rows, when there was still a Soviet Union, and I was sitting in Moscow honing my language expertise. Obviously, a very different time. Probably second pivotal experience was sitting in the Abkhaz region of Georgia after the 1992 to 94 war. And then if you look at what's happened this century with Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008, the aggressive modernization they embarked upon after they did their own lessons learned after that war, and what we've seen in 2014 and 2018, I would encourage you, as studiers of this problem, to think of it not episodically as what are we doing about what's happened since February 2022, but what does the recent history, in particular the post-Soviet history, of Russia's actions in its near abroad, whether it's a direct invasion, as we've seen twice now with Ukraine and once with Georgia, or whether it's other destabilizing activities along its periphery. What do those mean in the context of our global security environment? And what does it mean if we don't send a strong deterrent message to the actions that we've seen to date? And I really look forward to the conversation and the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, John.
Okay, Art said that we could talk at any time. And so I'm just going to add this because I think Laura just brought up a great point. So as you think about what she just said, think about also this bifurcation that we're starting to see, where these authoritarian states are lining up: North Korea, Russia, China, Iran, all supporting effort, whether it be through arms or in cahoots with each other or supporting this fight. Against now, you see this huge alliance here as a result of this fight here on the West as well. You know, over 40 have now joined the team to supply the Ukrainians and others. So start thinking about how the world looks, where you got democracy against authoritarian states here. I think that's pretty key, and thanks for.
I'm going to have an easy time as a moderator, I can tell. I'm not going to have to. MSNBC has a bargain with you.
Yeah.
General Saint-Louis from Montreal, bienvenue. He has served several times in Washington. His regiment actually his outfit originally was based in Quebec. Thanks very much for coming up from Washington and down from Canada. And we were talking before, and I was reminding you that really close friends, your best friends, as is Canada, are also very candid with you. And we're delighted you're here today. What are your initial thoughts, sir?
We'll see how candid I can be. Like, I realize the uniform I'm wearing and the country I represent, but I will ask you to be kind with me and not like leave the room or tweet out of this room. Prime Minister Trudeau, guess what your general just said, okay? Folks, first of all, just like General Potter mentioned, I feel privileged to be invited on this panel. I feel very inadequate to be amongst these senior current leaders and retired leaders, and I hope I can add some of this allied and partner perspective to our conversation. I welcome the fact that I have the next generation of senior leaders here in the room, current citizen soldiers serving in the back. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an absolute privilege and honor to be with you, but I will admit that I am somewhat dislocated this morning. I was escorted off the plane by a state trooper and put in a cop car to drive here. That only has happened to me once at another time in my life. That can be a story for the lunch hour. But this actual great American who's a major in the National Guard was by design there to take me from the airport to come here. But I will admit that getting a drive in a cop car, he didn't put me in the back at least. I was allowed to sit in front. That was pretty special as we start this conversation. Before we start to get into it, I think it's important for me as a military in a Western democracy to acknowledge that today, President Zelensky is in my parliament in Ottawa, speaking to our parliamentarians, speaking to our Prime Minister, and ensuring that Canada continues to support this critical effort in Europe. He was just here in DC yesterday. He spoke at the UN General Assembly and already touched on the initial introductory remarks this will of nations to stand together in this critical fight is one of the topics that is foremost on our minds. I don't speak for my policymakers. I don't speak for my government. We do what we're told. That is the beauty of being in a democracy. But if you would be President Zelensky, if you would be a Ukrainian, if you would be one of the thousands of Ukrainian soldiers that Americans and British and Canadians have helped trained, you would worry as you hear the rhetoric, as some of our countries start second-guessing the viability of maintaining this support that costs a lot of treasure. For us, at least, not yet a lot of blood. Let's see.
Vital point, thank you. General Shepro, who is not only a retired general, but also a very close neighbor right down the street at Pratt & Whitney. What are your initial thoughts as we kick this off?
Thanks, Art. Well, I'm at the tail end of a lot of profound and good introductions. So I echo the thanks to the World Affairs Council, as well as I'm honored to be here with the current and future guarantors of global security. And I'm glad we're having this discussion. The future ain't what it used to be. And General Twitty brought out an important point this morning, and that is, how do we deter in the future? And what General Potter, General St. Louis have added is that we have to be able to think ahead in order to deter. And I'll tell you one thing I've learned in my experience that's central to deterrence is that it's good to have friends. And the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, has been the bulwark and arguably the most successful alliance that we've had to deter warfare. But how is it that it hasn't been able to deter conflict in Europe over the last couple decades? When you think Georgia in 2008, you think Crimea in 2014, you think what's going on in the Ukraine right now, and how will we be able to deter an escalation of this conflict and to be able to prevent it from spilling over into NATO borders and even globally? That would be catastrophic. We have to think differently. We have to understand how adversaries think today. We have to understand this gray area, this zone of competition short of the traditional line of military conflict. And I'll end by asking you a question. Globally, are we right now at a state of peace or a state of war? And can it be that we're at a state of war, but it's just that the character of war has changed? And so how do we fight that, and how do we deter it from getting worse? Thanks.
Thank you. Let's get right into it. How's the war going? What's the status? An update. We had Russia go in on a war that was going to last a couple of days. It blundered. We've had a counteroffensive from Ukraine. We've had NATO support the Ukrainian effort. Where are we? How's it going? Who would like to initially talk about the current status of the war in Ukraine? Yes, go ahead, Joe.
So the current status, as you look at things today, I think you all know that Russia has a defensive belt in the south. It's about 600 miles. About 400 miles of that were put in over a year's time frame. So it's a pretty elaborate defensive belt that consists of mines, wire obstacles, trench systems, concrete barriers, and then multiple forces beyond that to include reserve forces. And then prior to that, they have their reconnaissance forces. So they have a pretty good defensive belt that stretches all the way from the east all the way to the right vicinity of Odessa and down towards Crimea. And so when you take a look at that, as I said earlier, it takes time to get through all that. And as advanced as we are as a country, we do not have the type of technology to be able to break through the things that they're trying to break as well. There's something called a micklet out there. You guys ever heard of a micklet? You know, it has a shape charge on it, and it fires into the minefield, and it's supposed to blow up the minefields. Well, their minefields are so dense that they have to put soldiers, literally soldiers, that go in and really find these things to detonate them. They have to get in the trenches to be able to root infantry soldiers out. And oh, by the way, you hear talking about air cover and all that. They have very limited air cover, and so they're trying to make up for that with drones, with artillery and other things, when we would have air superiority to be able to ride under cover of some type of air cap for the U.S. to be able to go to those things, similar to what I did in Baghdad when I attacked into Baghdad in 2003. And so when folks ask, how are they doing? Well, they're doing extremely good from a tactical point. They're incrementally, they have two axes that are going down in the south, one near Zaporizhia, and one just east of there. And then they have in Bakhmut another supporting attack. They're doing pretty well on the Zaporizhia axis. They're incrementally taking land, incrementally. And it has been a slugfest. The Russians are giving a pretty good fight up. But the good thing is they're incrementally taking land. If they continue at this, the winter is going to start to settle in here. It's starting to get pretty cold over there. And then the next thing you know, the wet ice, snow, and all that stuff. So it's going to limit combat operations to the roads because most of it is a mechanized and a dismounted infantry fight. And so much of this will be limited. And so we could find ourselves, in fact, we will find ourselves, coming out of the winter next year and continuing this fight. And so I say all this to say that this fight is going to be a while. And if I'm a betting man, when we have this conference next year, we'll still be talking about this counteroffensive. But we should not place time in war. War is extremely unpredictable. And what we've done in the press, politically and elsewhere, we placed a timetable on these troops and put a lot of pressure on the Ukraine and the Ukrainian president. So we're making progress. It's incremental, it's tactical, but in my view, they could get there.
Anybody want to contradict, add to, other thoughts? General, please.
I just want to add.
Please.
So I won't add to the tactical fight, but if we zoom out a little bit, one of the areas that Russia is contesting the West, and they have been for a very long time, is in the information space. So no matter what question I get asked, even about the most tactical aspect of the fight, I start with reminding everyone this was an illegal, unprovoked, and unjust war. Because I run across people who actually don't really focus on that anymore. You know, we're a year and a half closing in a couple months on 2 years of a wartime buildup followed by an invasion that was illegal, unjust, and unprovoked. The second thing I would say is Russia failed to achieve its objectives. So it planned a war that had 4 fronts with a quick march to Kiev. And because of the will of the Ukrainian armed forces, because as General Saint-Louis mentioned, our nations developed deep allied and partner relationships, and we had been training alongside the men and women of the Ukrainian armed forces for years since the 2014-2015 invasion. So from a strategic perspective, Russia has seen quite a bit of failure and failed to achieve its objectives. They're also having to rely on older legacy equipment that they've got to bring to the front. They're expending a tremendous amount of munitions and equally a tremendous amount of soldiers' lives. So I think keeping the strategic context of the nature of this fight in context is also important.
Other thoughts? Tell
There's some great topics, great ideas developed by our 2 generals there. I would add that this willingness of nations to come together and either not fall trap to what's in the information or disinformation space cannot be taken for granted. And just the agreement on facts. This invasion is just that, an invasion. And thankfully, within NATO, last year when the invasion started, it was easier to gather and coalesce the will of the nations, in part with one of the points I had for us to tackle this morning is because there was greater intelligence sharing. There was a willingness by the US and other partners and allies that had access to some discrete, I heard the word exquisite in reference to widgets this morning, but there is exquisite intelligence that is not always shared. And that sharing during the months before the war made the coalescing of our governments, our senior leaders, much more palatable, easier, and believable. Our current NATO representative in Brussels for the military side was explaining that in 2014, when the Crimea invasion happens, and you present that at NATO as a fact, there were countries, NATO alliance members, who kind of said, BS, or it's not true, or are you sure? Like, yes, this is Russian forces. Well, we're not sure. We are not sure is like a NATO member saying that. That has changed a little bit. So while it was easier to coalesce that will at the start, I think it's worth bearing in mind, does that will maintain through election cycles, through disinformation, through fatigue, and through our own domestic demands on our folks, which makes every foreign policy essentially be a domestic policy.
Good point. General thoughts?
I'd add, so General Twitty laid down the tactical situation well. General San Luis talked about the gray area of disinformation and legal warfare, lawfare, which can really change people's opinions about a war. And are we going to approach an area of Ukraine fatigue where we start giving up? I'd say strategically, though, it's been a blunder for Russia. When you look at Russia's position in the world and world opinion right now, they've become a pariah. Where Russia had deftly been putting friction points and wedges in NATO, now they've promulgated or precipitated the adhesion of two strong allies, Finland, whose membership has been ratified, and Sweden, that's well on its way. Russia's tried to create a buffer zone by changing international lines by force, something that hadn't happened since World War II. And now they just added a 1,700-kilometer frontier of NATO membership to their border. So I say they have blundered. Is it time to gloat? No, in fact, that probably makes the situation even more dangerous because of Russia's nuclear doctrine. Russia's willing, and they've shown willingness in their doctrine, to escalate before their adversary does in order to terminate the conflict. So we need to respect that. And going back to General Twitty's opening remarks this morning, we need to relearn strategic deterrence. NATO is a nuclear alliance, by the way. It does have that arm. We need to relearn how we were able to deter nuclear conflict during the Cold War and bring back that expertise and that ability to deter.
Yeah,
You're a perfect, yeah.
if I could just add, there's no doubt that Russia and Putin definitely isolated at this particular point. You think about the friends that he's hanging out with now. Kim Jong-un, that tells you that he's isolated. He's getting UAVs from Iran, tells you that he's isolated. So his friends are extremely limited. But let's not kid ourselves. Yes, they've suffered tremendous amount of losses in Ukraine. But we also have to look at the big picture. Still an existential threat to the U.S. because of their nuclear weapons capability, and still a tremendous threat to the eastern flank, their neighbors, given the capability that he still has in his homeland to attack across the border, either Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, you name. So that eastern front is still vulnerable, even in the state that he's in. So that's the first point. The second point that I want to make in this, if Russia wins this war, we can define win however you want to call it. Guess what? It will be seen as a U.S. failure and a Western failure. I want you guys to keep that in mind. We've been supporting them. We've been at the forefront. We've been giving them equipment. You think about the impact if Russia wins this war. North Korea, China, all the bad, Iran, all of them, they're already aligned. The information space out there will go crazy. The U.S. and NATO, they've lost the war.
Let me now pick that up, because both of you talked about what's getting into there's the theme of this conference, tripwires, and both of you brought that up. There are two tripwires here. One, you talked about the Baltics and the Eastern Front and nuclear. So let me just pose it. Two tripwires. One is that NATO gets into armed conflict directly with Russia. And secondly, the virtually unthinkable, but you raised it, could that tripwire lead to nuclear warfare? General Saint Louis, get ready, because I want to ask you to respond to this first, because...
Just the junior guy in the room? What?
Yeah. Because when a country, a non-American country, follows and goes into a war with NATO, back home you got to be thinking, what happens here? Is this simply supply for Ukraine? Or does this lead NATO into the kind of tripwires we discussed? We'll all get a chance at it, but I thought you'd have a unique perspective on that one.
So I'll just remind your audience how important Ukraine is to Canada. With the exception of Ukraine itself and Russia, it is the place in the world where there's more people that say they are from Ukrainian descent. 1.4 million people identify as Ukrainian Canadians. They came at the turn of the century, have settled, and are now prospering in Canada. It is 4% of our population. That is a huge motivating factor for our governments to stay invested, notwithstanding these possible tripwires that have been mentioned. Our Deputy Prime Minister is from Ukrainian descent. Her grandmother or her grandparents on her mother's side came from Ukraine early on. Her mother was a professor of law, went back to Ukraine when they instituted democratic systems there. She has studied, been in Europe and in Russia, is on a not liked list from the KGB, whatever that means. I would be worried. So it is important to Canada, but Canada also prides itself on having its own foreign policy, and while it accepts and is blessed by the fact that its most important national interest is its relationship with the U.S., we have not always followed in every conflict lockstep. So the conviction we have with NATO, I think, is immuable. I don't know in English, something like very strong. We actually, as a nation, are pretty excited about what you just heard, the description of adding 2 new Nordic nations to the NATO alliance, solidifying through a concerted will. But there is for sure a concern that a NATO that is brought into the conflict will put us on this path to eventual nuclear confrontation, which was unthinkable 10, 15 years ago. We were thinking that deterrence was working. Deterrence has failed. And if deterrence has failed to dissuade a country to take part of another country, how far are we from deterrence failing of using a tactical nuclear weapon?
So, Shepro, you raised it.
Go ahead.
You raised it, the thought in your last intervention. What are your thoughts on this? I'll get to you.
Well, I'm second generation Ukrainian, so I care too. Just like so many people in Canada of Ukrainian descent. And I think, you know what comes to mind is, and I especially encourage the young officers and cadets here to really learn the world, learn how your friends see things, learn how your NATO allies see the world, learn how your adversaries see the world. Because if you try to mirror image what you think will work in a conflict or strategic situation, you'll blunder, as many times in history have shown. So get out there, learn the world, learn other languages, learn how your friends see the world, and know how you work together to bring about success and how you deter and confront your adversaries. I'm going to leave it broad like that, because when you get to nuclear deterrence, when you get to tactical deterrence, it's about capability. And I'm proud to still be in industry where we provide the warfighter with capability, with 5th generation and now what's called 6th generation capability that is able to win credibly, and that's how you deter, right? You show that you can win credibly and you can maintain a conflict. But at the same time, being able to deter with that, and I lost the rest of my thought.
Okay, General Potter, now, we got some tripwires here?
Well, I wanted to go back to your opening comment as you brought up the tripwire topic. So it contemplated a NATO fight with Russia. And I think a lot of you hear reinforcements from leaders from all of our nations, and certainly Secretary General Stoltenberg, of NATO being a defensive alliance. So I served in NATO for 3 years as a colonel in Belgium, and then 1 year in a deployed NATO billet in Afghanistan. And the NATO culture is so immersed in this idea of being a defensive alliance. Its planning is oriented around defending the alliance. It is steeped in the Washington Treaty. So that tripwire is tripped when Russia attacks a NATO ally and Article 5 is invoked. So that tripwire is a decision that Russia will or will not make. But to the point General Shepro made about, think particularly the young men and women in the room, of at what stage of conflict are we at right now, in the here and now? When I was in NATO as a colonel, NATO wasn't really contemplating, well, what if the first salvo of a fight is in space? Or what if the first salvo of a fight is in the cyber domain? And we're talking about a leader in Moscow who is willing to take out opposition figures living abroad, restrict opposition figures at home, and obviously everything it's done militarily. So I think as we look at those tripwires, reinforcing the noble purpose of this strong alliance that we have is very, very important, and it does have, in and of itself, a very strong deterrent value.
Okay.
Yeah, if I could just add that. First of all, I stayed in a Holiday Inn in Ukraine, so I care too. Just joking. A couple of things here as it relates to that. When you take a look at NATO and NATO's stance, even when you take a look at U.S. forces in Europe, and Laura can relate to these comments because every day I would drill her. She was my intelligence officer when we were in Europe. Every day she got drilled by me. I never thought for 1 second in the 2 years I was deputy commander of U.S. European Command that we were deterring Russia. I never thought we were deterring Russia. There were so many indicators out there that we were not deterring Russia. 2008, what did they do? They attacked into Georgia. 2014, what did they do? They took Crimea. Okay? And you could see the actions that they were doing inside Russia. So I think we were of the same mindset. We would do various actions that we would bring bombers over and all these things, and Russia would not even blink or change the course of the way that they were acting. Remember? And so we were always suspect of whether we were achieving our goal of deterrence. Then when you look at U.S. posture and NATO posture within inside Europe. What do you think, where do you think the majority of the U.S. forces are in Europe? In a Cold War stance, Germany. Germany. So U.S. forces are far from the eastern flank. Now, we're correcting that now, but we're far from the eastern flank. Where do you think the majority of NATO countries' forces in Europe? Mostly Western, in Western countries. And so we relied heavily on our new Eastern partners, former Soviet Union partners, to hold the flank. So we're in a Cold War stance, and you can't be in a Cold War stance because at the end of the day, you got to have boots on the ground and you got to show force on that flank. And I know Putin would look over that magical NATO-Russia line and say, there are all kind of opportunities here for me to exploit. And so just want to bring that into
Yeah, go ahead.
So Mr. House, before we started, kind of encouraged me to be critical of the U.S., which I said I won't do. So this is not intended to be sound that way, but I will give you an Ottawa perspective on why this deterrence didn't work or wasn't working, and as we're facing these tripwires now, I remember our government, our senior leaders, not being convinced a couple of years ago that the U.S. would continue to be such a leader in NATO, continue to believe so much in NATO as an alliance, willing to double down. And I'm not talking about if a NATO country gets attacked. I think we all agree what that would have led to. But things in the periphery, things in emerging domains, etc. I think the politics of our respective countries, the politics of this country, a couple of years ago would not have given much confidence, at least in my capital, that the U.S. would act in the way that it is acting now. And the way it is acting now is amazing. And that is the reason you have like-minded nations, in addition to the NATO nations, coming together, coordinating under U.S. leadership, the donation of equipment, the alignment of training, the helping of the Ukrainian forces withstand what they withstood for the last year. But that is a shift that is different that maybe 2-3 years ago, the criticism of NATO allies was what we heard. And today it is that leadership of this viable, vibrant alliance that is touted as the example of what could be repeated in other places.
You're very skilled. You didn't mention a single president, and you delivered a very eloquent message. Let me ask, Megan, if we do one question from the audience and then 1 minute each, have we got time for that? Okay, we got a question out there? Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yes, you need a mic. Have we got a mic? There's a fellow sprinting toward you.
We can repeat it also.
Yeah, and we can repeat it.
We talked about the external environment. It is very interesting how authoritarian governments are fighting each other in this extended war environment. But we do also have to look at, as I'm sure General Potter does, look at the internal reality in Russia. We use the word fraying. A lot of people think that Putin's power is fraying. He did withstand the challenge from Prigozhin, but it's not a good look. As we just read this week, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Moscow is kind of letting it all unroll. So Putin, sooner or later, Putin will go down, if only just by natural causes. Where does that leave this new balance of power, this new bifurcation when he goes?
Okay, anybody like to hit that one? Yeah, were you moving?
I was going to defer to
General?
General Potter.
So I'm certainly happy to start with that one. I think there's a couple contradictory maybe things going on in Russia. So on the one hand, I think the ground domain of their forces have taken a significant hit in terms of equipment. He has been contested in terms of Prigozhin. He, I think, has a significant people problem. If you look at the number of people he's got to send to the front, changes in conscription age, the balance between conscripts and contracted soldiers, the number of people he needs working in the defense industrial base if he's going to ramp up production. So I do think there is a people problem there. But to contradict that a bit, he still has very high approval ratings, if those ratings are to be believed, based on the control he has over the state. So I think whoever comes next in the leadership line, it's not just the leader, but it is the structure of the government that's in place, and I think that ship would be hard to turn on a dime. But I certainly think that it could be done, and I don't see any change, certainly, in terms of his strategy while he's in power.
Any quick additions to that?
No, I agree with everything she said.
I was going to say it's hard to predict. As Churchill said, it's an enigma wrapped in a riddle, wrapped in a mystery. As the Russians say, dovrye no provrye. So trust but verify. What you think they're going to do or what's going to happen, it might not be what's going to happen.
I think we often project.
Yeah.
I think we often project the outcome we want to have. We project what we would wish, and we have this romantic view of revolution springing up and yielding great partners and allies believing in Democrat. Our assessment is if there is to be change, which already is a big if, it wouldn't drastically change the course of current policy because of what was mentioned, structures, history, et cetera. The viability of an alternative that would put us on a path that is very different to the path we're on, I think is a long shot.
We could go on here for a really long time, but I'm out. I want to get 1 minute from each of you, thoughts that we've provoked here. We didn't get into strength of commitment. We didn't get into a lot of things, but this is a panel that could clearly go on for at least another half hour, which we don't have. So let's go back the other way for the 1 minute summary reflections to wrap it all up. General, go ahead.
Well, thank you for this great discussion. I remember what I was going to say. It's that this is what gives you tactical deterrence. It's the fist, it's the capability, it's the equipment, it's the tactics that you all will be mastering and developing. But it's this that will give you strategic deterrence. Its ability to think, to strategize, to scrutinize, to coordinate, to team and build teams of teams. That's what's going to make us safe and guarantee global security going ahead. So I'm honored to be with this panel in this forum. Thank you.
Thank you. Mon Général.
Premièrement, I am thankful to have learned this morning just listening to you, listening from your questions. And I'm looking at my notes of what I wanted to touch on, and a lot of the things that I got dribbled here, we have touched. One is still pending here, and I'm bringing you back to the tactical level, to the junior leaders that are here or future leaders. And it is the power of the defense. I'm an infantry soldier, like you heard in my bio. I'll tell you quickly the story within this minute that I have already blown. As an instructor at the infantry school when I was a captain, or as a battle group commander training my troops to deploy, or at a brigade command, I often had lieutenants and sergeants come to me and say, "Sir, c'est de la merde," which I won't translate in English. "We are digging trenches." Why am I digging a trench? We will never dig trenches. We will be maneuvering. We will be on the offensive. We will be maneuvering. We will have overwhelming power and air superiority on our side, and we will win, because that was what we were seeing. The power of the defense is being played out, like you heard in the description. And what does that mean for us as we generate and get ready for the next peer-on-peer fight?
Thank you. General.
So I'll leave you with a couple of things. One, our continued support to Ukraine, which has shown incredible will, innovation on the battlefield, the ability to rapidly learn from us as we and our allies provision them with equipment to see this through. And as General Twitty mentioned, that may take some time. The second point is, when I was preparing for this, I actually decided I just want to look up the dictionary definition of tipping points. So the point at which a series of small changes or incidents becomes significant enough to cause a large change. And I talked about what one might think of in the broad historical context as small changes of the map. Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Nagorno-Karabakh, Georgia 2008, 2 wars in Chechnya, and where we are now with Ukraine. In broad historical multi-decade analysis, you might consider those small changes. Should we add to those small changes the transactional yet deepening relationship between Russia and Iran bilaterally, Russia and China bilaterally, Russia and North Korea bilaterally? Should we add to that the evolution of BRICS, which was mentioned in the climate panel, which was dismissed almost outright 10 years ago when I was a War College student? Should we add to that the fact that there is ambition, if wherever a line on the map might be drawn in Ukraine, if there is a peace settlement, Russia's ambition is not going to stop. So I would ask everyone to keep an eye on Russia's strategic maneuvering in the next several years as a potential tipping point.
Thank you. General, go ahead.
Hey, I would just say, particularly for you young folks here in the room here, if you take a hard look at this fight, we assume that the international rule-based orders that's been in place since World War II and the laws of armed conflict would be enduring. Take a look what Russia is doing in Ukraine. That's the type of war that you're going to fight, where there are no rules-based orders, where there's no law of armed conflict, where civilians are going to be slaughtered and no one really cares on the Russian side. Take a look at the technology that we thought would be game-changing. Yes, the UAVs are great, and they're doing a great job. But that is not decisive technology, and that's not a tipping point. At the end of the day, what you're seeing is World War II-based warfare in Ukraine, where we thought we would never, ever see this type of warfare again. Soldiers in trenches, tank-on-tank warfare, artillery, massive artillery, all the things that we thought that we've advanced from through technology. At the end of the day, it's going to be you, boots in the mud, that's going to provide decisive victory for our country. Don't ever forget that. And so there will be no equipment that's going to advance this war the way you're going to advance it, and that is on the ground fighting it, or in the air fighting it, or on maritime fighting it. Don't ever forget that. That's why it's important for you to ensure that you think of technology as a means to use to be able to destroy the enemy, but it's going to be you with the fist that he talked about in the mind to take the decisive fight to the enemy and win it for our country. And that's what I would provide.
Thank you, John. I'm going to wrap it up. Luke, come up to the mic, because when we're done, Luke has a message for us. I'd just like to say, first of all, a really profound thanks to all the panel members. There was an outstanding group of panelists, and the discussion was just remarkable. So let's give them a big round of applause.